before I tell you when and where we will be going in today's case, I first want to introduce you to the sponsor of this video, Free Cash. Have you ever wanted to turn your gaming time into real money? Let me show you how you can with today's sponsor, Free Cash. Free Cash is a free online platform where you can earn real money by playing mobile games, completing surveys, and testing apps. It's super straightforward. You pick an offer, complete the tasks, and get rewarded. And it's not some sketchy site either. Free Cash has a 4.7 rating on Trustpilot, with thousands of positive reviews. Here's how it works. You choose a game offer that looks interesting, like this one. Here you need to reach a certain level in the game, and once you do, you get coins that you can later cash out. Each offer clearly shows how much you can earn and what you need to do. And make sure you enable app tracking, otherwise your progress might not track properly and you won't get rewarded. Once you've done that, you just play. I usually do this while watching TV or just relaxing, and you can track your progress directly on Free Cash. You can cash out as soon as you hit just $20, whether you prefer transferring to PayPal or redeeming an Amazon gift card. Use my link or scan the QR code on screen to try it yourself, and don't miss out on the $5 bonus when you start your first offer. The more offers you complete, the more rewards you unlock, so why not give it a try? Now let's go to mid-19th century England. James Blomfield Rush was born in 1800, the illegitimate son of a woman named Miss Mary Blomfield. She had been engaged, but the man refused to marry her, and eventually the engagement ended. She did, however, marry a man named Mr. John Rush, who was a farmer in the village of Felmington in Norfolk. At that time, James, who was 2 years old, was permitted to take his mother's married name and was treated by his stepfather with much kindness, as he had no children of his own. Eventually, Mr. John Rush adopted him. James was sent to school in the market town of Eye, in the county of Suffolk, and he was soon known to be a shrewd and clever child. Yet he was given to trickery and was sometimes involved in altercations with other students. When he left school, his attention was directed towards agriculture. His stepfather had a tenancy on a farm owned by the Reverend George Preston, and the Reverend offered James a lease on another of his farms, just outside the town of Aylsham, which was 12 miles north of the city of Norwich. James managed the farm well, and was also given the position of bailiff and steward for the Preston estates. However, there was much local gossip about his moral character. Some questioned his practices, and the manner in which he conducted both his business and his private affairs. Despite this, he maintained an outward respectability. He regularly attended his parish church and associated with reputable families, who regarded him as a polite young man with good prospects. In May 1825, he married a young lady named Miss Susanna Soames, the daughter of a highly respectable local gentleman. Following the marriage, the couple moved to the village of Wood Dalling, where James took a lease on a larger farm. He was hard-working and was trying to make a name for himself in the local area. Those who knew him hoped that marriage and responsibility would encourage James to have a more settled and dependable way of life, but it seemed to instead have the opposite effect. He became increasingly absorbed in reading the writings of William Cobbett, the journalist, pamphleteer and politician, renowned for his fierce criticism of corruption and his defence of rural working people during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He also studied The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, and under their influence, he developed a growing distrust of established authority and a restless radical outlook. Gradually, he withdrew from society and from his former equals and began to associate with individuals described as being of a lower taste and habits. There was much political discontent among agricultural labourers in 1830, particularly over the introduction of threshing machines. On the 24th of November that year, a crowd assembled in the village of Fulsham with the intent of destroying the machines. However, when confronted by landowners on horseback, the crowd dispersed. Some fled towards Dalling Farm, where a man named Mr. Joyce was apprehended. James Blomfield Rush was nearby, and learning that Mr. Joyce had been caught, urged those present to rescue him. After a brief struggle, they succeeded. James was indicted for aiding in the rescue. However, a compromise followed. He agreed to keep the peace, and in return the formal charge was withdrawn. In the following year, a wheat stack on his farm was consumed by fire under quite strange circumstances, and although the cause of the blaze remained uncertain, local people quickly attached suspicion to James. but there was no concrete evidence linking him to the fire, and no charges could be sustained. Instead, James pursued a claim with the insurance company, demanding compensation for the loss to the sum of £76.16. The matter was referred to arbitration, and after deliberation, a reduced settlement of £57.07 was agreed. Meanwhile, his private life began to unravel in ways that stood in sharp contrast to his public appearance. He was known to be a libertine, which in the mid-19th century meant a person who indulged in desires without concern for morality, family, or social consequences. A woman named Miss Dank brought a case against him for breach of promise of marriage. She had become pregnant, and he had given her no support. Unable to pay for her own legal fees, she was allowed to bring the case to court as a poor woman, and after a trial that was held at the Norwich Assizes, a verdict was returned in her favour, with costs of £26. However, despite this corrupt and immoral behaviour, James managed to hide it completely from his wife and family, and it was noted that friends who stayed at the farm for days or even weeks never noticed anything amiss. In fact, in public, his manners remained polite and unobjectionable. A close friend of his wife, who stayed at the farm for a week, went as far as to say that she had never seen him look or speak in a way that could have offended even the most sensitive or proper-minded person. It seemed apparent that James's ability to conceal his true nature allowed him to continue to maintain the appearance of respectability. In 1835, James became the tenant of Felmington Farm. Then in 1836, he obtained a 12-year lease on Stanfield Hall farm, despite his stepfather advising him that he was taking on too much. In October 1837, the Reverend Preston died, and his son, Isaac Jeremy Preston, took over the ownership of Stanfield Hall and the other farms. James Rush did not get on very well with him, and there were many disagreements between them. Mr. Isaac Jeremy Preston cancelled some leases that his father had granted to James, claiming a legal flaw because an important clause had been left out. James, however, argued that Mr. Preston, who was a barrister and had already approved the leases, was now using this flaw to increase the rents. He also said that he had spent £3,085 improving the 683 acres of land. However, repeated rulings against him for breaking lease agreements suggested that his improvements were not always in line with his obligations. Stanfield Hall had long been a source of uncertainty and disputes. Proprietors had died without a direct male heir, and the question of succession was never entirely straightforward. In 1750, William Jeremy came into possession of the estate on the death of his wife. He later married Frances Preston, and upon her death, the property passed into the Preston family line. However, the terms of the will suggested that the estate should have descended into the nearest male relative, bearing the name Jeremy, which left a continued question over who was the rightful owner. The Preston family had been able to produce papers which showed that any distant Jeremy interest had been transferred to them, and with no one able or willing to mount a successful challenge, the estate had remained in the Preston hands for over 80 years. By the time it descended to the Reverend George Preston, the Preston title had long been treated as established, even though its origins could still be questioned. In 1837, soon after Isaac took possession, a man named Thomas Jeremy appeared, claiming to be the rightful heir and disputing the Preston title. Although he was removed from the property and took no immediate legal action, the episode revived doubts about the legitimacy of the Prestons' claim and reopened the question of who truly owned Stanfield Hall. Isaac, whose middle name was Jeremy, then dropped the name Preston, and from then on was known as Mr. Isaac Jeremy. But the incident had left Mr. Isaac Jeremy somewhat uneasy about the situation, and he entered into an agreement with Mr. Rush. He sold him Stanfield Hall for the sum of £1,000, and then repurchased it for the same amount. This was done to create a clear and formal record of ownership, in case the title was ever disputed again. Soon afterwards, Mr. Rush purchased Potash Farm in his own name for the sum of £3,750 and applied to Mr. Jeremy for a mortgage to fund the greater part of the sum. Remembering what he believed to be a considerable favour that Mr. Rush had done him in assisting with the selling and repurchasing of Stanfield Hall, Mr. Jeremy agreed. He advanced £3,500 at 5% interest for a term of 8 years. After a while, however, James began to struggle financially. The high rents on his other farms, combined with 2 years of poor harvests due to bad weather, had drained his resources. These setbacks, along with legal fees and the cost of raising 9 children, had left him deeply in debt. Yet even as money tightened, he still found his way to London, where he spent freely on entertainment and social connections. In 1844, tragedy struck the household when his stepfather was found dead from a gunshot wound behind the ear, and the gun was lying beside him. The death was recorded as accidental, yet there was a suspicion that something far more sinister may have occurred. Then in November 1845, misfortune struck once more when James's wife died. Although rumours of foul play again circulated in the neighbourhoods, nothing was formally established. Her passing left the house without direction, and James was soon obliged to seek assistance to manage the daily running of the home. By now his eldest son was married and working and living elsewhere, so he sent 4 of his children to school in France and 2 more to school in London. He seemed unaware of the financial pressures he faced and the fact that he had a mortgage payment due to Mr. Isaac Jermy. He decided to employ both a housekeeper and a governess, and although it was easy to find suitable staff, none stayed very long. All complained that Mr. James Rush would try and seduce them, and due to this improper conduct, they would leave his service. In January 1848, he once again found himself without a governess. He placed an advertisement in the Times, stating that he required a well-educated young lady to oversee the instruction and care of his children, and offered what he described as a comfortable position in a respectable country household. He presented himself as a respectable and honest widower who had farms in Norfolk, and his manners and outward appearance made a favourable impression, so no one had any reason to doubt his trustworthiness. He eventually appointed a young lady named Miss Emily Sanford. She was 23 years old and one of 10 children. She had lived in Notting Hill, and although her family were once wealthy, her father had lost most of his money by speculating in railway shares. However, once she had taken up her position, Mr. Rush began to pursue her. He intercepted her letters to and from her family and gradually cut her off from outside supports. Over time, worn down by persistence and reassured by his promises, she yielded to his influence and placed her trust in a man who had carefully arranged her dependence upon him. It was not long before she discovered that she was pregnant. Following this, he arranged lodgings for her in London and instructed her to say that she was married to a man named Mr. James and that he was her uncle. But tragically, the baby lived only briefly and died soon after being born. By now his money situation had worsened, and creditors were insisting upon immediate repayment. However, he did not have any available funds, and his property was already mortgaged, which meant that his financial crisis was becoming increasingly more difficult to contain. His relationship with Isaac Jermy was also becoming more strained. He was struggling to pay the rent on his farms, and Mr. Jermy was now threatening him with eviction. In a desperate attempt to create some leverage against his landlord, he published a pamphlet claiming that Mr. Isaac Jermy was not in fact the rightful owner of Stanfield Hall. He contacted the solicitor for Thomas Jermy, who had come to the house in 1837, and aligned himself with the claim that he was the rightful owner of the property. He told the gentleman's solicitor that he could help restore the estate to the Jermy family, and that he would get financial support from Emily Stanford, who he claimed was a wealthy heiress. By doing this, he negotiated himself the promise of lower future rents. He persuaded them to come to Norfolk to formalise matters, which they did, and he ensured that their presence was publicly observed. Afterwards, he produced forged documents, supposedly from Isaac Jermy, offering reduced rents and the cancellation of the Potash Farm mortgage in exchange for his backing against Thomas Jermy's claim. The fraudulent papers were witnessed by Emily Sanford. On the evening of the 28th of November 1848, at about 7 o'clock, James left the house. He had been in a strange mood, and it was presumed that it was due to his mounting debts that had left him increasingly troubled and under severe pressure. That day straw had been spread around his property, as the poor weather had turned the garden and surrounding fields into mud. He walked towards Stanfield Hall, as he knew very well that each night after dinner, Mr. Isaac Jermy would step onto the porch for a few moments of air. He was worried about his financial problems and had convinced himself that his fortunes could only be restored by removing those he believed stood in his way. As he approached the hall, he put on a wig and false beard. It was dark, but he saw Mr. Isaac Jermy standing upon the porch, and without hesitation, Mr. Rush raised his gun and fired twice, killing the poor gentleman where he stood. He then entered the house by a side door, where he encountered Mr. Jermy's son. He fired another shot, and he too fell dead almost instantly. Mrs. Jermy rushed forward to her husband, and Mr. Rush fired at her as well. She was struck in the arm and badly wounded, though not killed. The maid, Miss Eliza Chastney, hurried to her mistress's side and pulled her away from the doorway towards safety. Mr. Rush fired again, and this time the shot struck the maid in the leg. In an effort to create confusion and divert suspicion, Mr. Rush scattered written notices about the house. In them he claimed that a group was outside and ready to take possession of the hall. He had signed the notes, Thomas Jermy, the owner. He then left and calmly walked back to his house. He arrived at about 9:30 and told Emily Sanford that if questioned, she must say that he had been absent no longer than 10 minutes. He then went to bed. Meanwhile, at the hall, the police had been contacted, and the maid told them that the man responsible for the shootings was Mr. James Rush. The next morning, officers came to his house and arrested him. However, strangely, they agreed to his request that he be allowed to finish breakfast before being taken away. As they left, he reminded Emily of what she needed to say. The same day, Stanfield Hall and its grounds were searched, and the moat was drained. Potash Farm was also examined, and officers uncovered additional disguises along with papers and forged title deeds. At the inquest into the deaths of the two Mr. Jermys, the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder, and Mr. James Rush was formally charged and committed to Norwich Castle Jail to await his trial. While in custody, he displayed a curious composure, even arranging for his meals to be sent in from the Bell Inn rather than accepting prison food. The crime was reported throughout the country and caused so much excitement that people travelled from London to Stanfield Hall to try and see firsthand the scene of the crime. The trial of Mr. James Blomfield Rush opened at Norwich on the 29th of March 1849 amid extraordinary public interest. Emily Sanford proved to be a very important witness. Called upon to give evidence, she provided a detailed account of the months leading up to the murders. As she and Mr. James Rush had never married, she was obliged to testify, and she did so without hesitation. Her statements were very precise. She admitted that Mr. Rush had been away from their home for at least an hour and a half on the night in question, and that he had told her that she must say that he went out for no more than 10 minutes. Many other witnesses gave testimony. Several described how Mr. Rush had taken care to confirm that both Mr. Jermys would be at Stanfield Hall that evening. They told how he made inquiries about their movements, especially their movements after dinner. Others spoke of the discovery of the disguises and the suspicious documents at his house. Throughout the proceedings, Mr. Rush chose to conduct his own defence. However, his speeches were long and often unfocused. He declared his innocence and spoke of religious principles, and frequently addressed the judge, jury and witnesses in an aggressive manner, but failed to address the evidence that suggested that he had carefully planned and carried out the shooting. Many documents had been taken from his house and were produced in court. These included both genuine contracts alongside the ones he had forged, and demonstrated that the deaths of the two Mr. Jermys would have strengthened his claim to Potash Farm and eased his financial burdens. The proceedings received extensive press coverage. Some wrote of Emily's frail appearance, and although this drew some sympathy, the newspapers noted that her admissions, particularly concerning her signature on forged documents, were deeply damaging to Mr. Rush's case. The maid, Miss Eliza Chastney, who was still suffering from the injuries she had received on the night of the attack, was also brought into court and placed upon a couch to give evidence. Her appearance made a deep impression on those present. Speaking with composure, despite her condition, she described how she had pulled her mistress to safety and had then been shot herself. She stated firmly that she was certain that the man she had seen in the hall was Mr. James Rush. When the time came for the defence, Mr. Rush rose to address the jury on his own behalf. He spoke at length, revisiting points already covered and attempting to cast doubt on the testimony against him. Yet he offered no convincing explanation that could counter the many witnesses that had been presented. After the judge had summed up the case, the jury withdrew to deliberate, and they returned just a few moments later to announce that they found the defendant guilty. In passing sentence, Judge Baron Rolfe reflected upon the chain of conduct that had led James Rush to that moment and looking straight at him. He said that if he had honoured his promise of marriage to the woman who he had seduced, the law's restriction of a wife's testimony might have spared him from such exposure. Instead, his private misconduct had left him vulnerable to justice. The papers wrote at length of the verdict and sentence, some dwelling on the speed with which the jury had reached the decision, others reflecting on the striking contrast between the man who had once had a respectable place within the community to the criminal that was now condemned to hang. On the 21st of April 1849, James Blomfield Rush was executed. Thousands attended, some arriving on special trains from London. After the hanging, a death mass was taken, and he was buried in an unmarked grave at the Norwich prison. I would like to thank FreeCash for sponsoring today's video, and if you would like to download the app, scan the QR code or click on the link below. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.